Folks. Thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Mortensen with Americans for Limited Government, and I'm joined today by Kerry McDonald. She is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. She's also the author of Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. So clearly, Kerry, you are an expert in the area of homeschooling, and I brought you on to see if you could explain to us what we have been seeing in the last 18 months or so in the area of homeschooling.
Well, it's great to be with you, Catherine. Yeah, for the past 18 months, there has been just a wave, I think, of parent re-empowerment when it comes to their children's education. Beginning in the spring of 2020 with widespread school closures, parents got, for the first time, a close-up look at what was happening in their children's schools through district Zoom schooling. And a lot of what they saw, they didn't like. Maybe they realized the curriculum was a little too watered down for their preference, or maybe they didn't like some of the ideological bent that they saw in their classroom, the child's classrooms. And so really beginning last summer, homeschool numbers began to climb, and the US Census Bureau 2020 data that came out in February of 2021 found that the homeschooling rate doubled in 2020 alone to now more than 5 million students being homeschooled in the US, which is more than 11% of the overall K-12 school-age population. And this was a tripling from pre-pandemic homeschooling levels. The most recent federal data there dates back to 2016, when there were just under 2 million homeschoolers. So now we are just seeing such a interest in home-based education. And I think that that's really going to continue unabated this year. You know, I would have thought that there would have been a slowdown as many schools opened for full-time in-person learning this academic year. And I think instead we're seeing rising interest in homeschooling.
And Kerry, what do you think is going on? I mean, clearly the pandemic is front and center here. The mandates, the masks, all of that. So I assume that's a big part of what's going on. Tell me what else is happening here.
Yeah, so a couple things are going on. I'll use the example of, for example, Texas. One of the homeschool grassroots advocacy groups in Texas said that they've had triple the interest in homeschooling this year compared to last year, which of course was already record highs. So they've had 3 times the number of emails and phone calls from prospective parents about homeschooling, suggesting that we're really going to continue to see an exodus from district schools. So last year nationwide, overall public school enrollment dropped an average of 3%. Some areas was much higher than that. I think of, for example, Los Angeles public schools losing almost 5% of their students from public schools. And they were switching, for the most part, into homeschooling or private education or delaying school entry. And I think that exodus is going to continue as we're seeing some of these signals out of Texas and some other places. Mask mandates are certainly a key part of that, and that goes both ways. That's parents who are frustrated that their school districts are imposing mask mandates, and they don't like that. They don't want their kids masked all day. But it's also parents who are unhappy that their schools aren't imposing mask mandates, and they want their kids to be masked. And so they're pulling their kids out to homeschool them or to switch over to a different school that might have a mask mandate. So it really cuts both ways. I think we also see, the continued emphasis on critical race theory and some of the identity politics in classrooms and curriculum that's also affecting parents. I think of a school in Palm Beach County, Florida, for example, that lost 10% of its population last year due to mask mandates. So parents pulled their kids out last academic year because they didn't want their kids wearing masks. This year, the district said that they weren't going to impose a mask mandate. So the parents were thinking about sending their kids back, or at least some of them who had pulled them for homeschooling were thinking about sending their kids back this year. And then they all got notice about this equity statement that got distributed around the district that had some of this sort of racially divisive language and really focused on on sort of equity instead of equality of opportunity and so on. And parents didn't like that. So they decided to continue homeschooling this year. So there's all kinds of reasons. I think pandemic policies are certainly a key part of that. But there's some other factors going on around curriculum and ideology. And then there's just the fact that the more homeschoolers we have, the more positive network effects there are. The more of a community there are more resources and activities and classes and mentorship opportunities for families. So it becomes, sort of an accepted choice with a whole bunch of opportunities for families.
I love that, Kerry. You're talking about the network, because that really is how it works. I have two children, although my youngest child just graduated last year, so he's out, but that is how it works. Parents who may never have thought of homeschooling in the past now sort of find that there's networks of friends from church or their neighborhood that they can tap into and learn, like you said, for the first time, maybe this is a possibility for me. Maybe this will work for my family, because that is, I know as a parent, that's how I work, is tapping into those networks. But now for the last 30 or 40 years since I first sort of heard about homeschooling, I feel like it's always been kind of a sort of a small group that it hasn't been super mainstream, at least in years past. But now, according to your article, the Census Bureau is showing that this is super mainstream now. I mean, to the point where the largest increase in homeschooling is among Black students, which I feel like in the past, there felt like there was a stereotype that it was sort of Christian white families who were homeschooling their kids. But it looks like the census numbers you're looking at show that is definitely changing.
Yeah, so the homeschooling population was really growing and diversifying prior to the pandemic. Back to the 2016 federal data on homeschooling, they found that again, it was just under 2 million homeschoolers, roughly 3.5% of the overall school age population. Now we're over 11% in light of the pandemic response. But even again, back a couple of decades, we were seeing this increasing diversification of the homeschool population. The number one motivator, for example, of families choosing homeschooling, according to federal data in 2016, was concern about the environment of other schools, including safety, drugs, and negative peer pressure. And that was followed by a desire for academic excellence. So the sort of stereotype of homeschoolers as choosing homeschooling for religious reasons, just really doesn't show out in the data. In fact, I believe, according to the 2016 data, it was something like only 12% of families said that religious motivation was the number one factor in choosing homeschooling. So really changing. And then really demographically, homeschooling had also been changing since the turn of the millennium. But you're right, according to the Census Bureau, now we have a five-fold increase from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020 in the number of Black homeschoolers. And now Black homeschoolers are overrepresented in the homeschool population compared to their representation in the overall K-12 school age population. You have over 16% of the homeschool population now identifying as Black. That compares to about 15% in the K-12 public school population. And we have parity in other demographic areas. For example, the rate of Hispanic homeschoolers is about 1/4, and that mirrors their representation in the overall K-12 population.
So do you think that there's any other larger trends going on in terms of parents wanting greater freedom, more say in their children's education? Is there a trend there that you see?
Yeah, I think we're really at a transformational moment in American education. I think parents have been put back in charge of their children's education in unimaginable ways. We see skyrocketing support for school choice policies, many states introducing or expanding school choice legislation over the past 18 months. Most recent national survey data of taxpayers finds that we're at record support of school choice policies. More than 70% of taxpayers, according to the most recent Real Clear Opinion research polling, showing support for money following students instead of funding systems. So there's some real growth there. And then I think at the individual household level, families are realizing that they have more educational opportunities than they may have otherwise thought. And they are also discovering that homeschooling isn't this stereotypical image that they may have had. It's not moms sitting around a kitchen table with a bunch of textbooks replicating school at home. In fact, more likely, it looks like things like pandemic pods and these sort of small learning communities and micro schools that were gaining traction prior to the pandemic response and that have really taken off since then. And along with that, we now have a surge in education entrepreneurship, which is what I was writing about most recently in my Forbes article about these startups that are recognizing the demand from parents for schooling alternatives, for more free, more flexible, customizable, personalized educational experiences for their kids. And they are launching these different kinds of learning communities, whether it's these micro schools, whether it's sort of physical spaces in commercial storefronts that bring together multi-age groups of families with adult mentors. I wrote about a new startup here in Boston where I am called KaiPod Learning. They're participating right now in the Y Combinator Startup Accelerator Program, about to get some great funding. There's another startup called GetSchoolhouse.com that pairs families that want to create a home-based learning pod with other families, and they connect them with a certified teacher. They just raised over $8 million in venture capital funding this past April. So tremendous amount of educational entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs really stepping up to meet the demand for parents for schooling alternatives and for education innovation. And that's just going to continue to expand options for families.
Kerry, do you think that there's opportunities for parents where families where both parents work outside the home for them to homeschool through some of these new innovative pods that you're talking about? Or is this really something that where you do need one parent at home?
No, that's what I'm suggesting, is that even prior to the pandemic, homeschooling was much more, sort of an umbrella term for education innovation. That sort of the stereotype, again, of kind of kitchen table based homeschooling is just not reflective of 21st century homeschooling, and certainly not reflective of homeschooling now with this increase in homeschooling numbers. More often today, contemporary homeschooling looks like having your children participate in these different learning centers or micro school communities or co-op models. So it's very accessible to families who both work, or parents who both work.
Okay. And then my last question on that is are these things expensive? I mean, can middle class families participate, or how much do you pay for these micro learning opportunities?
Yeah, they're actually quite affordable. I mean, KaiPod Learning in particular is extremely affordable. I believe the number is you can get up to 50 hours of care for under $500 a week. If you wanted your child participating in that. That's here in the greater Boston area. Some of these other pods are even less expensive than that. And it really just depends on how a family wants to structure their co-op or their learning community, and how much they want to kind of pool their resources to hire an educator or a facilitator to lead a co-op. And many of these learning communities, especially the self-directed learning centers that I write a lot about in my Unschooled book, they have generous financial aid packages, sliding scales, and are already, even without that, a fraction of the cost of a typical private school in most areas.
So then I suppose to end the interview, I think that at a group like Americans for Limited Government, we might want to advocate for allowing families to take their tax dollars that are going into the public schools, and if they take their students out, those dollars ought to follow the student, and then families would be able to use that money for other options like you're talking about. I mean, is that something that people are advocating for?
Yes, that's what I mentioned earlier with the rise in support of school choice policies and state legislatures passing or expanding their existing school choice policies that allows funding to follow the student as opposed to funding these bureaucratic school systems. These would be things like education savings accounts, voucher programs, tax credit scholarship programs, and so on.
Right. Yeah, I think that has to be where this is going, because I mean, why should families pay twice, right? I mean, if the public school system isn't the right fit for your child, that money should follow the student, and they should be able to put it where it's a better fit.
Yeah,
so,
and I think, Catherine, too, not sorry to cut you off, but I think it would, having the money follow students instead of school systems would also alleviate a lot of these conflicts that we're seeing in public schools. I mean, you take the mask wars as a perfect example, where you have parents on one side demanding mask mandates in schools and parents on another side not wanting their kids masked in schools all day. Well, if we had funding following students instead of systems, then parents could take their kid out of that assigned district school and find a school that reflected their values and their perspectives. And the same thing is true with curriculum and overall educational approach. So, and one of the things I often say is we have so much choice and personalization in every other area of our lives. But when it comes to K-12 education, it's this cookie cutter government run system for the most part. And so the more we can break that down and expand education choice for families, the better off families and students will be.
Thank you so much, Kerry. And I get your newsletter. I signed up for it several months ago, but if someone wants to get more information from you and follow what you're studying and the research you're putting out, where can people follow you?
Yeah, please visit my website at fee.org/Kerry, Kerry. There you can see links to my recent articles. You can see links to my social media accounts. Send me an email. And yes, please sign up for my weekly email newsletter.
Thank you so much, Kerry. I actually love your newsletter. I love the work that you all are doing at the Foundation for Economic Education. And thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. And I'll just give one last plug for your book. It is called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. Thank you very much, Kerry.
Thanks, Catherine.